Professor Pat Kilcoyne, as I said, is the Vice Chair of the Theology Department. We are very fortunate to have him here tonight. For 15 years, he was the Executive Director of the Harvard, BC, Ashkelon excavation in Israel, and he's going to be speaking tonight about how experiences abroad, studying, living, traveling, can be valuable to good education. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Kilcoyne.
Thank you very much for coming. I must say I find this a new experience, being such a wonderful excuse for dessert, but thank you anyway. What I would like to talk about tonight is the way we view study abroad, or the way we view foreign trips of a service nature, as part of something which is nourishing, reflective living. Something which makes us a little more aware of ourselves and of the humanity of which we're a part. And what I'd like to start with is the image of horizon. That each one of us, at any given time in our lives, has an horizon. And it is that which defines the boundaries of our vision, our understanding, our experience. Horizon defines the borders of our consciousness. In the medieval village, people lived and died in the same context. Very often they never left that village, and that was their world. The world and their village were coextensive. By 1950, for most people, one's horizon was pretty much defined by one's country, or in large countries such as the United States, the area of the country that one came from. I have a friend who comes from Colorado, and whenever he visits New York, he talks about, well, now I'm going back to America, when he leaves to go back to Colorado, because he finds New York so strange. Geography helped, therefore, to define our horizon. And interestingly enough, for immigrants before 1950, it helped to intensify their identification, because they had to be whatever they had come to writ large. So if you were Italian, you were more American than anyone else, to prove your loyalty to the new country. That around the year 1960 to 2000 changed, and changed radically. Domestically today, we are very often not the first one in our family, not even of the first generation in our family, to go to college. That represents a significant change in how our horizons are defined. New immigrants today are much more mobile. People do not come here and stay here pretty much evermore, but there are the regular visits back, whether it's to Mumbai, or whether it's to Honduras, or to Italy. Sociopolitically, we are a culture which I describe as post-Westphalian. That is to say, a culture which is not co-equal with, determined by, and completely controlled by the definition of the state of which you are a part. There are a lot of things which move us beyond that definition and awareness. As Americans, I would like to suggest that we experienced two fundamental, what I would call Copernican revolutions in our own personalities. That is to say, that we are not the center of the universe. And that was 9/11, and that was the war in Iraq. If you watch world news anywhere but in the United States, the 15 minutes are not devoted to George Bush or whoever's renting the property on Pennsylvania Avenue at any given time. That's peculiar to the United States. The 9/11 event, the Iraq event, and that presumption that we are the center of the universe is something which I think is unhealthy, and is something which I think seriously cripples our ability to relate to the rest of the world. Living beyond one's horizons, therefore, challenges, broadens, and invites us to revise our perceptions, and our understandings of interconnectedness and of how we see things afresh and often quite differently. I was very fortunate growing up to spend time at a graduate program in Oxford. And it was also one of the most traumatic experiences of my life, because I figured, going to London, they speak English, we speak English, fine. So the first morning, I leave the bed and breakfast in London where I was staying for the 2 weeks before I went up to the university. And there was a place I knew was close by. And I figured I'd go out, go to this, it was a bookstore. But I had to ask directions. So there's this guy coming down the street, and he's got the typical English derby hat on, and a three-piece suit with a vest, and a furled umbrella. It was furled even though it was pouring rain. And he had the paper stuck under his arm, and he's walking along. So I go over and said, "Sir, could you tell me where such and such a bookstore was?" And for the next 5 minutes, I didn't understand a word he said. As Mr. Churchill said, we are separated by the same language. That was a trauma, because I figured, if I can't even talk to these people, what's going to happen? I quickly moved along, however. And let me suggest a couple of the things that just being in that other place, so closely identified with our own, in terms of traditions, language, entertainment, all sorts of things. Two things that I really appreciated in a way that I never did before, and that was the careful use of language in civil conversation, political conversation, the art of debate or argument as a vital dimension in refining public policy. And I did that simply by sitting, no cost to me, in the visitors' gallery in the House of Commons. And for 1 or 2 weeks, I just went there every night, and it was the best show in town. Because you had humor, insight, command of information, respect for the person you disagreed with, and the use of speech to convince, not to browbeat, not to belittle, not to ridicule, but to convince, to win the hearts and minds, in a sense. And it was just an exercise in brilliance. The other experience that helped me in my own education was the experience of the tutorial program at Oxford, where you and maybe 1 or 2 other students write a paper every week, maybe 10, 12 pages, and you sit with one of the dons, one of the profs there, and for the first 2 or 3 weeks, they totally shred you, particularly if you're an American, because after all, we won the revolution. And after that, they engage you in the intricacies of research and questioning, and again, arguing and convincing and discovering. The whole awareness of participating in process with those experiences of the Parliament and the tutorial program, with things which gave me a very different attitude towards academics or towards whatever I do in terms of influencing policy things and whatnot. That you really can work to convince people, and that it is your obligation as a thoughtful human being not simply to, pick holes and to do an us against them and all those other rather cheap shots, which I think has characterized American society since Watergate, where either the Republicans find the immorality in your guy or the Democrats find the immorality in the other guy. The understanding of the depth of social problems is something which always has a little Novocaine coating when we look at it here in the United States. And that is not to say we don't have problems. But I never appreciated what poverty meant as clearly until I walked across the marketplace in Tangier in Morocco and saw a woman sitting there basically dressed in rags and dust, holding a screaming child and holding her hand out begging. Her hair was matted and it was gray, sort of like falling out. Half her teeth were gone. And the person who was taking me through the market square said, "Oh yeah, she's 31 years old." Now this person looked safely 20 years older than my grandmother, who was 90. And it was all diet, medical care, all those other things which in our infrastructure we come to expect in some way, however imperfectly. And I didn't sleep for 3 nights. It was just that very, very vivid experience of it, unfiltered, uncontextualized, just there. The only other time I saw it quite as severe is when I saw people living in the mausolea of the cemeteries of Cairo, with smokestacks sticking out of these mausolea and people sleeping on top of the tombs. The same thing in terms of race and ethnicity. If you have ever lived in Israel, you begin to appreciate the complexity of problems on that international level. I was introduced to it casually again, which is probably one of the best ways to get into it, because you're into it before you realize it. You know, if today you say, well, I'm going to study ethnicity problems, you sort of say, all right, that's an ethnicity problem, it goes away. I was flying, the first time I ever went to Israel, and it was from Paris. And as the air conditioning begins to hit you on a hot day, you fall asleep. And the woman who was sitting in the next seat also fell asleep, and our heads were having this magical banging together. And it turned out that the woman was Hanan Ashrawi, who is probably one of the most perceptive and incisive spokespersons for the Palestinian Authority, and was on the leadership group with Yasser Arafat when the Palestinian Authority was set up. And she was coming from visiting her sister in San Diego. And from that time in 1987 until the last time I was digging in Israel in 2000, I would have tea with her every summer, a couple of times in Jerusalem. And she would just very matter-of-factly talk about these things that we see on the evening news, but in terms of people, and in terms of the concrete living situation of people in the villages of Nablus and Ramallah. You had a very different understanding of conflict and the impact of that conflict when you met with someone working through it very directly, and then she took you to dinner in these homes where people were living. My impression of the situation over there has become very convinced that people outside of there have to be very careful lecturing either side, have to be very respectful of the fact that both sides have significant elements who are trying to work for peace. And that one of the problems is they've been fighting so long they've forgotten who started it. And that is something that we as Americans find very difficult to grasp if you're just reading it on the front pages of the New York Times. What I'd like to show you is a couple of examples, and they're just examples, of coming on things in a way which is not prepackaged. Most of our education has a semblance to half-hour TV segments. You have a semester. You know what you're going to start with in the semester, you know what's in the middle of the semester, and you know what you're going to finish with. You know what's the highlight of each day's class. And you know pretty much the conclusions, just like you know who's going to win on CSI. Archaeology is something a little different, because you never know quite what's under your foot. And you never know the context of it until you work with other people to put it together. 3 examples I'd like to show. First one is a single slide. In 604 BC, the Syrian armies came down the coast of the Mediterranean, laid siege to the city of Ashkelon, a port city, captured it, slaughtered all the citizens, and burned the city. Okay. I'm sorry, these lights... Is there any way to shut these lights off? Okay, don't worry about it. 4 college students in July of 1996 were digging in an area, and by digging I mean working with whisk brushes and trowels. They came down on this. Now what you're looking at, again, I'm sorry for the light, are leg 1, leg 2 bent, and a skull up here. The arm bones are in there, but they were not yet revealed. We identified this as a 17-year-old woman who was slaughtered by the Assyrians when they took the city, and in a field about half an inch deep of ash. We were the first ones to find her since October of 604. That sort of an experience brings an excavation to absolute silence. It's sort of a privileged moment where suddenly someone in time is reaching out to you in a way that you don't experience in other ways. And all of a sudden, the excavation, which normally is, you know, people have a CD player on and a little music and people are talking and joking, all of a sudden there was a dead silence. Because you were the first people with this young woman since the instant of her death. And suddenly you experienced, in a way that you don't experience when you read it in a text or hear it in a lecture, that the Assyrians were the most brutal conquering people of the ancient world, and they didn't take a city and turn it to their own economic advantage, but they leveled it. Because we were working acre after acre after acre of nothing but ash and broken pottery and bones. The next time I read those sections of the Bible describing the Assyrian conquest, I read them with a very different sense of the whole thing. This is another part of the site, and this, if that was 604 BC, this is roughly 300 CE. What you see here is the apse, the round backside of a building of the Byzantine period. And under it is a sewer. The sewer went here and then turned and went down. Over here, you have the marble trim of what was a tub. And there were 4 column bases, each of which was in the shape of a heart. And at the side of the tub, there was the inscription, "Enter and enjoy." Now over here, we found a small pottery making facility in which there were several hundred whole or partial oil lamps, all of which had different pornographic scenes on, sort of like the Kama Sutra in clay. So, we're clearing out, we remove the tub, it's gone, we extend the sewer, And in the sewer, and this was 1988, it was the first year I was supervising. I had 6 college students there. They started pulling stuff out of the sewer, which looked like chicken bones. About that big. And they started, and they were in sets. Then they started pulling out small materials somewhat similar to eggshells or ping pong ball shells, that thickness, that composition. And what we suddenly realized we had come on was a massive event of infanticide. That these were infant remains of 225 children who had been murdered at birth. And that was another moment when silence descended. Now, what's this all about, all these connected fragments? And this is where being shaken out of your current horizon helps develop a greater vividness of understanding and integration of one period to another and issues one to another. From the pottery lamps and from the bathtub with the inscription, we were able to conclude that that probably was the site of a brothel. The other thing which was interesting, which further confirmed that, was that all of the infant remains were male. Now, does that strike you as unusual? Correspondence from a businessman of Ashkelon to his wife when he was in Alexandria in Egypt said, "How are you doing? How are the children? How is the pregnancy proceeding? If it's a boy, keep it." The fact that these were all boys confirmed the fact that this probably was part of an industry which only wanted girls, who would be trained from infancy to work in this prostitution establishment. Now, that gave, in much more vivid terms than what we normally read in social analysis textbooks, the appreciation of very young human life in the ancient world. We all probably have read Oedipus and how he was set out on the mountainside to die because his father didn't want him. Well, that whole trivialization or dehumanization of the infant and this very calculated disposal of them in the sewer. And we know they were all strangled because the dental fragments had hemoglobin consistent with choking up blood, which would be consistent with strangulation. So that whole understanding of how society regarded the human condition in a particular period was much more clear than it had been before this event. That's the sewer. Third, and I'm just using this one site. I mean, I could go through sites in Europe and other places, but just to give you an idea of how working in a foreign place and working with people of different backgrounds on significant projects gives you a much stronger sense of some things than we have, let's say, just in the classroom. This is the city wall of Ashkelon, which was abandoned as a city when the Islamic armies destroyed it so that the Crusaders would not have a second port after Joppa. That wall was a cobbled wall sealed with mud plaster. And then it got 20 feet deep of silt. Every year, the dust storms in the Sahara blow dust over all of Syria-Palestine, and it serves as a fertilizer, but it also, if you are not living in the area, just builds up, builds up, builds up. And so what we did was, we tried to find where the wall was, and we did a sample cut in the silt. And this gives you a sense of how deep the silting was. Now this story has a bit of a funny edge to it in terms of the genuine spirit of inquiry and being frustrated. 40 people spent 7 weeks from 4 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon every day carrying 40-pound buckets of dirt to clear that out all by hand. Once we had found the wall, able to trace the wall, we cleared it a little further, and there you can see the wall revealed. The guy in the blue shirt was a Harvard graduate student who supervised that. Once we got that, we took bulldozers and plowed right across the surface of the wall so that we could use machinery to do it faster. The third year, this opened up. But that year, that graduate student had gone back to Harvard to study language. 3 feet from where he was standing, we found one of the most significant finds of the excavation. And that we found in what was a small chamber here on a road going up to the city gate. At 7 o'clock in the morning, I was working all the way up there, and I heard some screaming down below, and a Dartmouth sophomore had with her pickaxe in the dirt, instead of hearing the whoosh of sand, heard the click of pottery, and stopped, and they cleared it away. And in that chamber, and here we are standing there. That was when I was not as fat as I am now. Found this. And what it was a pottery jug about this big with a calf about that big. This was a shrine, and this was a calf symbolizing fertility, bull calf. Now, what that helped us understand somewhat was the whole story of the golden calf in the Bible. The New York Times reported that the Ashkelon dig found the golden calf. We didn't. It was bronze with silver coating. But the point was this. This figure, or figures like it, have been found up and down the coast of Israel, covering roughly a 1,200-year period, when calf worship, or the use of the calf as the symbol of the fertility god, was prevalent. What the Bible story is doing is speaking in hyperbolic terms. That is to say, you know, the fish was this big, and then when you get the story told by 12 people, the fish was this big. What the Bible story is saying, there never having been found a golden calf, is that even if your calves are calves of gold, they do not compete with the God of Israel. And the Bible story, read against this concrete stuff, makes all the sense in the world, granting the biblical authors are talking in the images of the people in the surrounding culture. And that's what that story of the calf at the foot of Mount Sinai is set against in terms of its cultural setting. So what we see here at Ashkelon, just one site, a number of seasons digging, is that participation in this gives one a much more vivid appreciation of the cultural developments of the region, gives one a much clearer understanding of many of the biblical texts in their context, and many of the biblical images you don't know dry and parched until you've been in the desert. The best thing I can compare it to is 10 hours at the beach without a Coke, what the back of your mouth feels like. Except that's what it feels like 15 minutes after you start work in the morning. That's what dry means. Or what running water is, contrasted with that. So just in that one site, we have a very, very vivid set of images which enliven our understanding of our own heritage and our understanding of the diversity of heritages throughout that region. Now, I would suggest to you that taking seriously placing oneself in another cultural environment on the level of immersion, not on the level of tiptoe through the tulips, and every night we go out and we find where McDonald's is because we really miss, the ground dead animal. I mean, there are American students who within the first 2 weeks of their staying in whatever country find the local McDonald's and they spend as much as $60 on hamburgers. That is not what I call experiencing a change in your horizon. That's what I call dietetic cowardice. On the other hand, if you open yourself up to this, and you can do this in England, you can do this in Egypt, you can do this in Central Europe, you can do this in Morocco or South America. But the question is what you bring to it, recognizing not that you are the representative of a superior culture, not that you're representative of an inferior culture, but that you are the representative of a culture which needs to be nourished by the interaction. You are the representative of a culture whose horizon needs to be made more flexible. It can be one of the most profound experiences in terms of personal growth of anything you will do in your 4 years. Again, what I am not talking about is what I refer to as cultural tourism. Oh, let's go visit the poor for 10 days and pat them on the head and feel good because we built a shack for them. What I am talking about is an experience which includes depth, which includes a certain amount of real demand placed on you, and which includes informed reflection, so that you attempt to integrate this into who you are and who you will be. If you can do that, this can be an extremely valuable experience, be it, wherever. And I started with England just to give that sense of extent of diversity. I have been very fortunate in that at different moments in my life, I have spent extended time in radically different cultural settings. In a favela in Mexico, where I also, in addition to culture, managed to pick up typhoid, and in other places which were unique, were challenging, and were ultimately most rewarding. But it's a question of how you approach this thing. And I think it stands in terms of what Hovey House and company are offering and other people. And I am not a commissioned agent of Hovey House, as a real opportunity that you have to try and fit in, either in summers, a semester, or a year. I would also suggest this. Having a summer job so that your brother or sister can go to college is virtuous. What I am saying, I am not saying your education stands or falls on this sort of thing. And I'm saying I respect people who try to watch out for the rest of the family and to provide for them and to help parents in a very expensive period of time. But if you can, plan things so that you still have a summer job, or plan things so that you do this and in some way. Take a look at it. Sometimes there's money available. Sometimes there isn't. But I realize it also involves a balancing act in terms of much more basic responsibilities. And I deeply respect people who have to do that. And please don't take this any other way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kilcoyne. We're going to have a floating mic. Any questions you have, raise your hand and we'll come around. Or comments, not just questions.
Please.
Hi. You were saying how when you have these experiences that you really need to have meaningful reflection. Could you maybe talk about some of the questions that you would suggest one reflects on? I'm going to go to El Salvador over spring break with Pedro Rupe, and so I would just like to get your thoughts on what kind of things we should be thinking about.
Okay. First of all, I would say this is going to vary place by place, okay? What are the underlying feeds which bring about the society that you're looking at? So, how do you understand the local culture? What is important to this community? What is important in terms of the value system? Are there things in the value system which, let's say, not initially, but after you take it in a while, differ from yours? How do priorities vary? What are broader factors which you may see evidence of here, such as foreign economic influence? How does this society understand itself? What is important to it? In some parts of the world, departing colonial powers have left beautiful parliament buildings which are now thoroughly empty. How does this community understand its organization? How does this community understand law? How does this community understand adjudication and accountability? What does this say about the way in which you live your life? And that's, that's not to take anything or everything that you bring with you that makes you and throw it in your face. It's just to say, understand how differently you are in terms of your dispositions, your priorities, your heritage, your concrete past history, and the history of someone your own age in the same situation. Depending on your personal and career interests, maybe focusing on questions of public health, on delivery systems, on questions of education, literacy. How does this society, could this society better make available to it staple diet? Not an American diet, a staple diet of nourishing food. How do you reach that understanding? How do you facilitate that? I mean, you can go on in a number of different directions. I think one of the things is, if the program has a good local facilitator, they will, to some degree, try and help you, pointing you in the right direction. I'm just sort of thinking of things when I go into a situation. That's what I look at. What is the infrastructure that makes up this society and makes it work or inhibits it? Do you want to follow up, or are you're good? Okay, fine. I just want to be sure I'm trying to speak to your question and not what you should be asking. Yes. Did you have your hand up? Okay. Please.
Did you find that? Did you find that your faith was ever challenged by making kind of those disturbing archaeological discoveries that you guys were finding? And if so, how did you go about reaffirming it? You said that it kind of changed your view of some of the Bible readings and stuff. I was just curious about that.
Yeah, in terms of the Bible, no. Simple answer. And in fact, a lot of the stuff that I was doing in Israel, my main area of interest in going there was 4th century Jerusalem, for the reason being that 4th century Jerusalem was where much of the way in which we in the West observe Holy Week and the sacraments of initiation, baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist were worked out in terms of how they celebrated them. And one of my areas of history, I'm basically a historian, one of my areas of history that I was particularly interested in was liturgical history. I think that if you have had a good Bible course, let's say for instance, if you were to do Biblical Heritage 1 and 2 here, with, let's say, David Vanderhooft or Yonda Gillihan or Fame Perkins or Martha Morrison, you would have sufficient background in the way in which the biblical text evolved, that what this would rather do would be to say, you know, more of a aha, now it's clearer. Like, for instance, that golden calf thing. You mean, I didn't run right from seeing the bronze calf to saying, you mean there wasn't a golden calf? Because I never, in reading that biblical text, I never presumed that there had to literally have been a golden calf for that story to be significant, since most of that narrative is intended as stories to help the Jewish people after the exile understand how they had become a people. God made them out of nothing. And the way in which that was taught in that period was by story, meaning a lot of it was not literal. Does that mean it was not true? No, it was not literal. Myths and fables carry the deepest truths of our society. Knowing that, this just reinforced that. And you know, the other stuff, I mean, I would say I was disturbed at the depth of deprivation in the destruction, but it makes the horror story of the Assyrians in the Bible all the more real. And the treatment of human life by the Roman Byzantine population helped understand why some people in that period saw the pagan culture to be bankrupt and to be looking for something more, and possibly in part explain the attractiveness of Christianity, which sought to elevate the culture. Now, where do you find your faith challenged? Well, I would say I spent 10 weeks doing intensive Spanish in Mexico, in Cuernavaca, halfway between the coast and Mexico City. And I lived in a favela, which meant I was living in, I'm not recommending this, there are schools and residences and this stuff, but I was interested in a couple of other things, and one of which was really to understand poverty. In packing crates, refrigerator crates and that sort of stuff that you see in Sears when they're delivering stuff. And there were 300 families living in this, and they had one water faucet. And the water faucet ran down the side of the hill along with all the excrement and everything else, and every time it rained, the whole village was washed into the bottom of the hill. Well, surprise, surprise, I got typhoid. I also learned to speak Spanish. But there was a real test of your belief in the love of one's fellow man. And fortunately there, in Cuernavaca, there was a bishop whose Sunday Mass was one of the most unforgettable Eucharists I have ever been to in my life. His Mass, which had, let's say, a mariachi band of about 40, and the cathedral was packed with campesinos and laborers, because they were setting up Cuernavaca as a laboring city, industrialized. So people were working round the clock. He would sit down after the gospel was read and talk for an hour and 15 minutes, and nobody moved. And he related the whole business of injustice and the gospel and who we are as a Christian community. in a way that I had never heard before. And it was what today in some circles might be called liberation theology. I mean, it was very definitely a liberation theme. But that also was where, if you're saying, where was your faith tested? It was in things like that. It was where at some point, some elements of the church had been very much allied with economic interests, working counter to the good of the general population. And I think that might be something that also might be problematic where you're going. That's where the issues were, not in terms of the Bible. I mean, since I don't teach the Bible myself, I feel quite comfortable in saying, you take the Bible course here, you're going to have a good background for that. Did you have your hand up? I'm sorry, does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, good. Yes? Could you speak a little?
Coming back from such travels and coming back to, I guess, what you're used to, how do you reconcile all these new learned knowledge with how you currently live? Because sometimes that's difficult.
Yeah. Well, to start out with your answer, it's difficult. I feel privileged being able to be a teacher. It is great to get up every morning and come in here and work with the people I have in class, whom I respect deeply, whom I find interesting, enjoyable to be with, and open. In terms of the gap, one of the things I think which is really important to point out is the gap. And what do we do about it? You know, to what degree do we take men and women for others to be more than some sort of a saccharine bumper sticker? One of the things that I regret not at all is no longer going over to Cambridge to run the dig. Because one of the things you are beset with as soon as you come across the bridge into Cambridge are all these self-congratulatory bumper stickers. You know, like, another mother for peace. Doesn't that just make you want to feel warm and cuddly all over? Did you ever meet a mother for war? So the challenge is to make issues alive and to indeed argue that these are issues sometimes in ways and at times where we are made to feel a little uncomfortable. And that is not in any sense to just lay guilt trips on people, but to bring people to a thoughtful awareness of how radical that gap is. And not particularly to focus on, and it's your fault, because it isn't. You know, by some cockeyed accident of biology, we happen to have been born into that 15% of population which has the golden spoon in its mouth. The question is, what are you going to do about it? And the question is, do you really want to believe that there is something you can do about it while still being somebody who's able to love another person and maybe raise a family and be true to the values that I think this institution and the tradition of this institution holds sacred? And that's a challenge. Now, do you want to follow up on that, or am I speaking to your question? Okay. I mean, because that really is ultimately the end product of your question in terms of how do you develop that reflective dimension to the experience? How do you make it more than cultural tourism? And depending on your experience, it varies. I mean, one of my most vivid experiences of England, aside from the Parliament in Oxford, was in 1965. I was coming up out of the London Underground, or as they say, the Tube. And I turned a corner, and it was an entire block of shells. This entire block had been destroyed in the Blitz of the 1940s, and still in 1965 had not been rebuilt. That is my most vivid reminder that war takes a hell of a lot longer to recover from than most Americans understand. You know, probably the best reminder of the length of recovery time is the scandal which continues along the Gulf Coast. If you ever want a healthy dose of reality, go to New Orleans. But that sort of thing, those reminders that human suffering is not simple, and human suffering does not come in half-hour or 3-year doses, but usually affecting whole generations of children. I mean, the most tragic thing in the Israel-Palestine situation, for instance, are those children who, in a sense, have been denied education for what you would count as your whole grammar school period because of the irregularity of opening and closing of schools in the territories and the West Bank and Gaza. You can always rebuild houses, but if the primary education of children is how to direct a rock at an armored car, you have a very different set of experiences forming your youth. Other questions? Please.
I was just wondering, what are some of the places you've been and what were you doing there exactly?
Many people ask what I was doing. Well, I spent a considerable amount of time in Mexico doing Spanish because I was working in a lot of projects in New York City where Spanish was the first language. I did graduate work at Oxford, and while I was there, lived in London for a while in addition to Oxford, and also dug for 2 weeks at Hadrian's Wall. That was in 1965. In 72, I was in Mexico, and then from 87 to 2001, I was in Israel every summer for 7 weeks. In addition to Israel, some of the study there was in Egypt and Jordan and Turkey and in Greece. And then I, at other times, been in other places. But in terms of study and briefly I was in Southeast Asia for a while, but that's other stuff. Now, what's the rest of your question? Okay. Please, over here.
You said that 10 days in a particular place is nothing more than patting the poor on the head and cultural tourism.
Can be.
So what is the minimum amount of time that one needs to spend in a place to immerse oneself in the culture?
Can be.
Can be.
Okay. I want to be very careful about that because a good program of a week to 2 weeks can be an eye-opener, can be insightful, and can move one along. And I certainly feel a number of programs that I am aware of a service nature around here, which have those components. And the people who set the programs up here work very hard at doing that. You know, that's why design is important. That's why some of these things of insisting that one go to a series of sessions before one ever goes in country. Crack the program up to be more than just 10 days. I would say the more pertinent part of your question is what are the components in making a program which is appropriately reflective. And that's why I would say that if you have people who are experienced with the country and with the issues, the cultural, and I'm using this term, cultural tourism downside is minimized. I mean, I had people working for me at Ashkelon for 7 weeks whom I am convinced were clueless at the end of it, because all they lived for was to go out and get drunk every night. It's just, you know, an unfortunate fact. The vast majority of people who work there, the vast majority of people I've seen in most of these programs do not do that. If somebody wants to prove that there are more partial horses in the world than whole horses, they are free to do so. And I can't do anything about that. But I would say if you have a planned program, well prepared, with good group leaders, who have apportioned time there for conversation with people who are trained in terms of introducing people to the cultural situation, 10 days can do it. I mean, it's not a black and white answer.
In 10 days, do you think that gets enough away from the prepackaged element?
It can. It really can. You know, and I say that, I don't think I say that in any sense as a cockeyed optimist, but I think that from a number of the programs that I know of, and the people I know working in connection with them, they are working with a lot of conviction and not a little smarts, you know? They got the brain screwed on right. So I would say that can happen. Now, again, if you've got somebody who wants to wander down to the barrio and play the big American, nothing to do about that. You know, if you get somebody who goes on one of these trips with something to prove, the learning buttons are shutting off left and right, and there's nothing you can do about that. But if you get somebody who brings a sincerity, who has done the prep work, and who is clued in well conversationally with their own group leader, I think they can get something out of it, and particularly if that's the only time they have for it. I guess the thing is, one has to go at these things, be they 2 months or be they 10 days, one has to go at these things with a sense of this being a privileged moment for me, whatever the time is. And not being particularly hung up over what's the deficiency of it. If you go at one of these things with a sense you're going to get something out of it, you will. And again, I don't think that's a pie-in-the-sky attitude, nor is it saying everything's perfect. But I think we got more than a reasonable number of people working rather hard to create a variety of opportunities for people. And if they connect those opportunities with other things they're doing to try and learn and form themselves and broaden their horizon, right on. I mean, none of these things should be regarded as the magic bullet horizon expander. But they certainly, I think, contribute vitally in terms of different educational options. Please. This thing is structured so that we give the microphone bearer as much exercise as we can possibly give.
We'll just finish up with this last question here. You were talking about, you know, the large, let's say, cultural gap between us and what would be the rest of the world, and I was wondering if we were to be the only, or if you're suggesting that we should be the only ones to actually try to narrow that gap. I was having this long conversation with my dad last night about he's a weapons contractor for the military and, you know, all those three-letter organizations and so on. And he was trying to convey for me the kind of thinking that they need to do and try to, anticipate the sort of thinking as you were thinking, the education that might be different between ourselves and those trying to point a rocket at an armored car. And I was wondering, from our standpoint, our pedestal up and high, is it really, should it be us that are also trying to narrow that gap, or is it others that should try to be doing the same?
Let me answer that on two levels. One of the things I participated in Jerusalem was a program which was hosted at the Benedictine monastery in the old city, Mount Zion, Domitian Abbey. And they had made themselves a center whereby Palestinians and Israelis could come together in a neutral area to talk. And over a 3-year period, you met this whole group of young people who were very much working on a very grassroots level to do that bridge building, to do that exchange that was necessary. Some of them had actually set up a kibbutz with Western Christians, Israelis, and Palestinians for a common life and shared industrial goals. Obviously, if we are the only ones who are doing this, any effort to break down barriers is doomed to failure, because it's sort of like a high-class form almost of colonialism. If I can't save you one way, I'll save you another way. I was not so much talking about this as that which transforms the world. I was talking about this as that which makes us more effective members of the world. One of the things that we observed in the various intelligence services immediately after 9/11 was the vast dearth of Arab-speaking translators, so that the message traffic coming out of that region of the world could not be digested in a time rate suitable for the information therefrom derived to be fed back for action orders. But aside from the fact that my primary focus in this, and using this horizon image, was to look at an underdeveloped, or potentially underdeveloped area in our own society, which is reinforced by the fact that we don't have to talk to anybody in other than English or maybe Spanish. And that puts us at a distinct disadvantage in relating to friend and foe alike. There are people in many of these cultures who are trying to break out of ghettos in which they find themselves existing. I mean, for instance, educated middle-class women in the Emirates, in Egypt, in Saudi. But they're facing their own difficulties. And, I'm not quite sure what we can do about that, since some of the people who traditionally have given more money to terrorism than other countries are some of our bosom buddy allies. And I'm speaking specifically about Saudi Arabia. So I think that the question is a fair question. I think there are people within many of the cultures who are trying to do this. I would also point out that we have roundly much more money than any of them, so that we have more of an opportunity than many of them. And the security restrictions on foreign students the first 2 years after 9/11 certainly didn't help that. Does that, I mean, do you want to follow up on that?
No.
You good? Thank you very much. If anybody would like to talk about this at all after this, I'd be happy if you drop in to my office, 314 in this building. We do, from the theology department, have 3 overseas programs which we are mounting this summer. One to Ashkelon, where some funding is available. There will be a meeting on that, I think, next week. We also have a 3-week program in Rome, which begins before graduation, so you'd leave around the 17th of May and be back on the 7th of June. Those are for people who are still more in touch with the real world, which is to say they need a summer job. And we have a 3rd program for people involved in comparative religious studies in Istanbul with Professor James Morris. Thank you.